In this video, we'll consider another kind of good, the common pool resource. This type of resource can be subject to the so-called tragedy of the commons, that is, where resources are overused to the point of depletion, leading ultimately to harm for the people who use the resource. First, let's define a common pool resource. Two traits are key. First, common pool resources are rival. That is, one person's benefit interferes with another's. Second, common pool resources are non-excludable. That is, anyone who wants to benefit from the resource can claim the benefit. The name tragedy of the commons comes from the medieval practice of farmers grazing their animals on shared grassland, the commons. However, when farmers all grazed their animals on the commons, the grass would all be eaten, and the commons would end up a muddy mess that was no good for grazing. A more modern case of a common pool resource would be something like fish in international waters. These fish are clearly rival. Each fish one person pulls out of the water is not available for anyone else. They're also non-excludable. With no obvious authority to limit fishing in international waters, anyone who wishes can fish as much as they like. The result of this is overfishing. That is, people can only benefit from the fish if they take them, and no one can stop them from taking them. As a result, people take the fish until there are none left. The fish are depleted. This problem of overuse or resource depletion is the natural consequence of a good that is both rival and non-excludable. So what can we do about it? There are basically four options: collective agreements, privatization, regulation, and internalizing the externality. Some have suggested that no one really wants the common pool resource to be depleted. So there's an incentive for those who want to use it to come to some sort of collective agreement about how to ensure that the resource isn't depleted. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her research into this phenomenon. She found that the tragedy of the commons is not particularly common. Often communities seem to be able to manage common pool resources and avoid the tragedy of the commons. Ostrom identified four factors that make this ability for self-organization more likely. First, the resource has definable boundaries. Second, the community is dependent on the resource. There are no easily available substitutes, so people realize that depletion would be a problem. Third, there is a community, that is, a small group of people with strong social ties. Fourth, there are well-defined rules about how the resource can be used, with punishments for those who deviate from these rules. In these cases, the government need not act at all. A second option is to privatize the commons. The commons effectively are owned by no one, and what no one owns, no one cares for. However, if you give ownership to someone, then the owner has an incentive to make sure that the resource is not depleted. A classic case here involves elephants. Two African countries, Kenya and Zimbabwe, took different approaches on how to handle their elephant populations. In Kenya, elephants were treated as public property. Individuals were not allowed to own them. In Zimbabwe, though, elephants were allowed to be owned by individuals. The population of elephants in Kenya fell precipitously thanks to poaching. After all, the government can't watch every elephant in the country, and with ownership being banned, the only way to take ownership of the elephant's valuable tusks was to hunt them in secret. However, in Zimbabwe, the elephant population increased during that same period. Private ownership effectively turned elephants into ranch animals, and were generally not too worried about the possibility of cows going extinct. As long as the owner of the elephants also owns the elephants' babies, there's an incentive to encourage the elephants to breed. And certainly there's an incentive to protect your elephants from poachers. A third option is to regulate the use of the commons. For example, in the United States, there are generally restrictions on which fish you're allowed to fish, both in terms of breed and in terms of size. This is designed to allow young fish the chance to mature to the point where they can breed, preventing depopulation. A final option is to internalize the externality. The idea here is that part of the harm done by using the resource is external to the person using it. It is an externality. So people don't think about resource depletion when they claim common pool resources for themselves. It's not because people can't think about resource depletion. Ranchers typically don't slaughter their entire herds just to maximize their momentary production. It's that the resource depletion will mostly affect other users of the common pool resource. That is, the effect is external to the decision maker. So, one option that the government may try is charging people for the harm they do to the resource. By making people pay attention to resource depletion, people will curtail their use of the resource. In effect, they will internalize the externality. To sum up, the tragedy of the commons arises when a good is rival but non-excludable, typically taking the form of resource depletion. However, this tragedy can be prevented by collective agreements, privatization, regulation, or internalizing the externality.